I'm Dr. David Perlmutter, and welcome to the Empowering Neurologist. We are going to explore an area today that's really quite fascinating. Our guest is Mark Wolynn, and he's written a very compelling book that indicates that the experiences of our ancestors can influence us even today in our lives, that previous traumas can be actually inherited. His book is called It Didn't Start With You. A very, very interesting read. Certainly sheds a new light in terms of our understanding about what influences us. He is, Mark Wolynn, a leading expert in this notion of what is called inherited family trauma. He serves as the director of the Family Constellation Institute, which is located in San Francisco. And he has trained a multitude of clinicians and has treated thousands of individuals with a variety of issues, including depression, anxiety, panic disorder, self-injury, even chronic pain. He is a very sought-after speaker. His book really is very interesting to read, talking again about how traumatic experiences in the past, in terms of our ancestors, can affect us even today. It's a very pragmatic, very accessible, and a very actionable guide. So let's just jump right into this interview. Well, I'm real excited to jump right in here. This is really interesting information, and Mark Wolynn is our guest. Let me welcome you, Mark, to the program.
Thank you for having me, David.
So it's a challenging notion here that we know we are influenced moment to moment by our own early life experiences. And the notion that our parents' experiences and even grandparents' traumatic experiences can color our world today it's certainly not anything that everyone is going to embrace. So how did you come to get this information and then begin to work with it?
Quite accidentally, actually. I worked with cases where the root of the issue, did not sit in the childhood, did not sit in the in utero experience. I remember my first case that led me in this direction. I worked with a woman who was a cutter. She wasn't, didn't cut in the normal way, if there's a normal way at all of cutting.
That's true.
But she would cut so deeply that she would almost bleed out. She would hit veins, and her parents would have to take her to the hospital. And that was strange detail number one, the depth at which she cut. And I asked her, let's call her Sarah for the sake of this conversation. I said, Sarah, what do you think about right before you cut, right as you hold that razor blade? What's your thought? And she said, I deserve to die. And here I am looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life had just begun. And I said to her, Sarah, what have you done? Did you accidentally take somebody's life? Did you break up with someone? They hung themselves? And she said, no, nothing like that. And so when I looked for where this idea of I deserve to die, and I cut so deeply, I almost die, nothing was to be found in the childhood. Lovely parents, lovely relationship with her mom, lovely relationship with her dad, bonding excellent with her mom, thorough when we looked here. Then I asked the question, tell me about the rest of your family history. Tell me about your grandmother. And boom, she drops the bomb. Well, my grandmother was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk, and my grandfather was in the passenger seat, and she hit a pole, and my grandfather went through the windshield, got cut on the glass, bled out, and died before the ambulance could get there. And my grandmother drank herself to death after this, didn't live very many years after that. My father was 12 at the time. And all of a sudden, we made a deep connection. For me, it was quite startling. Here was the very issue that science now backs up with the studies on epigenetics. But here, 20 years ago, was the very source of her cutting and the feeling right before the cutting, what I learned to look for in this trauma language that we all carry, living a generation behind, 2 generations technically. And
Well,
I,
we are sort of given the idea that that children are born kind of with a blank slate. There's really not much on the hard drive. But I think what you're saying now is that there is this emotional legacy that carries transgenerationally, and then you mentioned that this is backed up by epigenetics, and for our viewers again, there is clear scientific evidence that there are gene modifications that occur that are hereditary, that we inherit modifications in gene expression that have occurred in our grandparents, even that the health of our grandparents influences not only their children, who are our parents, but our health as well, especially as it relates to things like inflammation and obesity. So you had that chance event. Louis Pasteur said that chance favors the prepared mind. And the question is, what do you do with that chance event? What happened then to allow you to use that information, explore the notion, and then begin actually treating people?
yeah, so I worked with Sarah in a couple different ways. One, I had her have a conversation with her grandparents because in my work, I would call this an identification. She would be identified with her grandfather when she cuts and she bleeds out and almost dies, and an identification with her grandmother when she feels that she deserves to die. It's almost though the rightful owner of the feeling I deserve to die has traveled 2 generations down the pike. And we know, as you said, this no notion of the clean hard drive. We know that certain epigenetic mechanisms escape this erasure process. That we used to think we're born with that clean hard drive. Now we find out that our children can be born. We can be born with fears and feelings that aren't always ours. That we contain the fallout of these traumas from our parents and grandparents, perhaps even our great grandparents.
So let me ask you then, when we are seeing individuals, when you're treating patients, is there a difference in their presentation or their symptom complex that would indicate that the transgenerational inheritance of trauma might be at play versus a person who had a bad early life experience and now we're seeing the manifestation?
Well, first of all, we're talking about biological traumas here. So it's a brand new field. So the way people would treat this is pretty new. I've been working in a way for 20 years that's been effective. And what I've been doing is helping people who are affected by trauma, whether it's our trauma in our early life or trauma that we've inherited biologically, to come upon a new image, to have a new experience that overrides the trauma cycle. So every time we have this new experience or practice or revisit the feelings of this new experience, we're literally pulling traction away from the limbic system or the trauma centers of the brain and bringing engagement to the prefrontal cortex where, number one, we can make sense of it and integrate it, but where we can also have plastic change, real neuroplastic change happens. So going back to Sarah, I not only had her have a conversation with both dead grandparents. Now that might seem unusual because they're gone. It's not a real conversation. She has to close her eyes and visualize this conversation. But in visualizing an action or a conversation, this, as you know, the same regions of the brain, the same neurons light up, become activated as though we're actually having the real experience. So that was way number one I worked with Sarah. Way number two I worked with Sarah is I said, can you bring your dad into my office and you just sit over here on the side and let me work with him, because what the mechanism that allows these traumas to move forward in our generations appears to me to be exclusion and unresolved traumas. So the more we exclude or don't talk about or push away the trauma, the greater the effects seem to continue. So I had her father, who could never talk about his father because his father was beloved. He couldn't talk about his mother because of the feelings of hatred and blame. And because this trauma lay unresolved in the family system, my goal was to find some resolution a little further back, if possible, that would have affected, we'll call her Sarah. And so I had Sarah sit on the side of the office while I worked with her dad to come back to into his heart, to be able to grieve his dad, and to be able to look behind his mother and to see that behind the drinking were just a host of other traumas that contributed to her. The way he looked at it is, this was personal. My mom's a terrible person. She drank. She killed my father. When we broadened the landscape, what we found is he could open his heart to his mother, grieve his father, and this had a palliative, more than that, it had a deep healing effect.
So is it your contention then that had you not pursued these avenues, that the problem would have remained unresolved?
Yeah, I think so, because often we don't know we're having a problem. We think the problem resides in us. We think, oh, I'm just wired this way. I cut myself because that's who I am, or that's how I feel. We never think to make the link to our condition or our issue and what took place in the generation before, or perhaps the one before that.
Well, it brings up a couple of interesting concepts. And first, the notion that what you just said, we are wired in a certain way. And I really want to emphasize to our viewers that, modern science really does make it very clear that we have the opportunity to volitionally or take command over how our brain is wired. We, as was just mentioned, using our ability of the prefrontal cortex, can choose to explore areas of thought in our minds that can then ultimately become new pathways that are differently connected. The brain is what we call plastic, meaning it can rewire itself. The rule of Hebb is that neurons that fire together wire together, meaning the more you do something, it's what we call perhaps muscle memory, where repetition ultimately allows pathways to be facilitated. And I think what we're hearing now is that we have the ability to rewrite our stories by utilizing this information. Dr. Andrew Newberg up in Pennsylvania has done a lot of work actually imaging the brain and the changes that happen in the brain from a functional perspective when we're engaged, for example, in meditation. Dr. Michael Merzenich in California is really one of the pioneers in neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, and has really well described these mechanisms. So what we're hearing today is really founded in some pretty hardcore science. But I think, Mark, that what you're saying is, as you put it in the book, we really have to shake the family tree. I love that term.
Yeah, exactly. We have to shake the family tree and ask the questions that we've not asked, or we've asked and hadn't had answers to. Because again, we're walking around with this idea that we are the problem, and we're not making the link to these events, these traumatic events that most of the time have remained in secret or unresolved or unhealed. We think that if we keep the past tightly sealed, and we do this, of course, by not talking, by keeping our lips sealed, that we're immunizing our children from the effects of what took place before. But the opposite seems to be true.
Wow.
The less we know, the more a parent keeps quiet. There seems to be the opposite effect takes place, that the more the children seem to continue these traumas, and it doesn't have to be this way. Yeah, we shake the family tree. We see what family secrets haven't been told, what stories have been.
You had an interesting case, actually several. One was of a woman who virtually out of the blue had a very loving relationship with her husband, and suddenly became virtually indifferent to him. And it was unclear to everybody, but you made a discovery there.
Sometimes we can look at when we reach a certain age or a certain milestone, the trauma of the past, as though there's an ancestral alarm clock inside us, starts ringing. And so this particular woman, when she was married for a couple years, and as soon as she reached the age 26, her feelings for her husband out of the blue seemed to disappear, which was curious to her, which is why she sought help. Most people would leave. She had enough insight to know that, okay, this is really strange. I loved this guy and everything was going well. And here, all of a sudden, this year, I feel nothing. I'm dead inside. And when we explored the family history, we found that at the same age, her grandmother, at 26, became a widow when the beloved grandfather drowned in a fishing accident. At that same age, her mother emotionally started to pull away from her father. Though they stayed married, the mother became indifferent. And here, again, at the same age, 2 generations later, she is about to leave her husband. And once we explored and did some work around it, her feelings for her husband returned.
So we may all be carrying quite a bit of baggage that we, according to your book, that we really weren't aware of before. I mean, we think we have a couple of bags ready for the trip here that we got from our early life experience, but now we've got a whole room full of potential issues that can be on, as you mentioned, an alarm clock and may go off years from now at a particular time and may be the root cause of some of our very unexplained issues in life.
Yeah. This is why I listen for trauma language, what I call core language.
What's it look like?
Beautiful. So Sarah's sentence, "I deserve to die." Our sentence, "I could go crazy." Our sentence, "I could lose everything." Our sentence, "I could harm my child." I once worked with this woman who was consumed with anxiety as soon as she became a new mother. She hit a milestone. No anxiety prior, but she gets married, no anxiety. She gets pregnant and is consumed with anxiety. All she knew is, I'm shaky, I'm nervous, I'm about to pass out. She doesn't make a link, but using some of the questions I outline in the book, we discovered that she had a horrific fear that she would harm her new baby. And I asked the simple question, what I call a bridging question, did anyone in your family ever harm a baby? And she said, no. Oh my! And she makes.
As a matter of fact.
As a matter of fact, her grandmother was I'll tell you the interesting. They weren't allowed to talk about the story, but her grandmother, as a young woman, lit a candle, caught the curtains on fire, caught the house on fire, couldn't get her newborn out of the house who was upstairs. And the baby died, but you were never allowed to talk about this. You walked on eggshells around grandma. And the trauma, grandma's terror, I harmed my new baby, lived in this woman, again, 2 generations down the pike, as soon as she becomes pregnant. So we have to look at these milestones that we hit as well as ages. You know, a particular age in the family when things happen, or a particular milestone. We get married and all of a sudden we feel heavy or deadened or burdened, or we leave home for the first time, or we get our heart broken. I once worked with this man who he couldn't go, here's his language, his trauma language, "I can't go anywhere new." So say that again, what do you mean? He said, well, I can't go anywhere new. And he keeps repeating anywhere new. So I'm holding up my sleeve this idea of anywhere new. He can't go to a restaurant with his family. He can't take a vacation. He can't go to the town next door. And then he drops the bomb. 74 members of his family were killed in the Holocaust. They were literally forcibly taken from their homes to somewhere new, a concentration camp, where they were murdered. Now he knows about the Holocaust trauma, but he doesn't have an idea that epigenetically he's carrying components of it.
So for an event like 9/11 rather, we may not be anywhere near fully appreciating the extent of the fallout from that event for another generation.
Absolutely. In fact,
I had an interesting experience years ago. I had a young man come to see me, great big Latin fellow, and his left arm was paralyzed. And we did every test we could and couldn't find any cause for that left arm paralysis. Couldn't move his arm. You could put a needle in it, it wouldn't move, and it just sort of got worse with time until the extent that it was totally paralyzed, just hanging at his side. And like yourself, I tried to explore it as deeply as I could and asked him about his family. And it turns out that his mother had undergone a mastectomy, and during the course of that left-sided mastectomy, the nerves in her left shoulder were compromised and, in fact, rendered her with paralysis of her left arm. And
Beautiful.
I explained that to him when I learned, and of course he didn't think there was any relationship because, of course, he couldn't move his arm, and it was all very well and good. Well, I don't have any particular expertise in the type of analysis that you do, so what I did was I administered sodium amytal, which is truth serum, where you really, you can't filter things. You really pretty well have to speak the truth and do what you're told. And I videotaped him, and under this sodium amytal, I asked him to move his arm, and of course he was able to raise it up perfectly fine. And what happened thereafter when he awakened from the amytal, which, after a couple of hours, I showed him the video. And I didn't know what to expect, but it was a good thing. And I explained that he was carrying this issue from his mother, sort of a sympathetic paralysis, if you will. And that was what I needed to do. It's certainly a little bit more primitive than the work that you're doing, but nonetheless, I mean, it just shows to go you, as they say, that the mind can carry a lot of stuff and can manifest in some very powerful ways.
Brilliant move, actually. And what's interesting is we don't know the components, the mechanisms. So I'm assuming the mother had the left arm paralysis while he was already post in utero. So he's already a child. So the other mechanisms we look at are things like unconscious loyalty. Now, what does that mean? But you saw it firsthand that there was an unconscious loyalty, sort of a sympathetic paralysis that he shared with his mother, that he couldn't have more than she. That it's almost as if he's saying at an unconscious level, Mom, if you have this paralysis on your left side, I'll share it too, so you're not alone in it. I see this all the time. Now, thankfully, we also have the science behind these, the epigenetics. We can talk now about how gene changes affect generations sometimes after a trauma, that our genes will either move in this direction or this direction, turn up, turn down, turn off, turn on, based on a trauma. And these effects can last 3 generations. But what about a case like you're talking about, where someone is sharing the alcoholism or the early death or the suicide or the paralysis?
Yes, and again, this is sort of the Lamarckian idea that our environment and manipulating our environment, for example, what Lamarck was all about, was in some way able to change our genes for future generations, and that was soundly rejected by mainstream science. And now we understand that. We understand that structural and, in fact, expression modification of our genes happens and then is transmitted generation after generation. Well, let me thank you for spending time with us today. This is really very, very interesting information. How can people learn more about the work that you do?
I have a website, markwolynn.com, WOLYNN.com, or my book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, just published by Viking.
And we will certainly make sure that our viewers see that information on the screen. So let me thank you for your time today, and it's very, very intriguing information. And I think the mission here is not to say that this is really outside the box. I think the mission is to make the box bigger and allow all of us to embrace the fact that we need to bring more tools into the toolbox if we're really going to be effective for issues that are very, very challenging. And certainly some of the cases you described today and in the book were very challenging. So it's, God bless, it's great work.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking to you and meeting you finally.
Great. Well, we'll talk soon. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
That certainly was some very interesting information, and I'm sure you will all agree that it's a bit challenging for us to recognize that, in fact, some of these issues may influence us today that have occurred to our ancestors. Again, the book is It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolynn, a very, very interesting read. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter.